Welcome, everybody, to another Village Torah portion discussion with me, your host, Rabbi Drew. And this week's Torah portion is Vayakhel. We are still in the book of Exodus, and some years, like last year, it actually is a double portion with next week's Torah portion of Pekudei. But this year, because it's a leap year and we have an extra month of Adar, which we are currently in the first month of the extra Hadar. So we have Vayakhel. Now, a lot of what happens in this week's Torah portion concerns the construction of the Mishkan. Now, a lot of this actually has really been instructed in a previous Torah portion. So it was the instructions, God saying, we really need to do these things. Here are the instructions. You need to do X, Y, and Z and construct it. This Torah portion is the constructing. So really not a lot of new material. It really is in many ways a redux, a rehashing of it. It's really the carrying out of God's instructions and the creation of the Mishkan, which I've described before. I mean, it's almost easier to talk about just in the Hebrew, because a translation would be tabernacle. I think it's a very common translation of it, a little unwieldy to call tabernacle. I don't really relate to it. Another way of describing it might sound a little flippant. I know saying apartment, or actually perhaps even more aptly, God's mobile home amongst the Jewish people. But it's a really fancy structure. Now, one thing that stands out that is different from the instructions that God had instructed the Jews was one particular thing that I think is really interesting, which I'm going to share here. So we have here in chapter 38 that the altar, so now we have, this is the carrying out of the building. And actually the builder is, as it was supposed to be, and from a previous Torah portion, it's Bezalel. So Bezalel is the sort of the master craftsman here, creating really everything. And so he's in charge. He is I don't want to call him the foreman, but he's definitely in charge of everything. So, we see in chapter 37, he makes the ark out of the wood with gold, the poles, there cherubim, really great stuff. Now, we then move on to the lampstand, the incense altar, acacia wood with gold. Now we get to the 38th chapter, in which we see the Mizbeach HaOlah, so the altar for burnt offerings. Okay, all these things. And I imagine it's really interesting to engineers, to people who love building things. This is really neat. But for most of us who are not particularly skilled with building things, perhaps less so. But this is where I found something of interest, at least to me, and hopefully other people here will find it of interest as well. What we encounter in verse 8 in this 38th chapter is that he made the laver. Now, the laver, it's washing. We could call it a sort of a washing station. Laver, in Hebrew, is actually kior. So I'll read the Hebrew. Vayas et hakior nechoshet be'et kano nechoshet b'marot hatzovos asher tzavu petach ohel mohed. So he made this kior nechoshes, this copper. I'll call it a washing station. Laver, maybe that's from Latin. I don't know. And it's stand of copper. Nothing particularly crazy. Now, actually, I want to switch over to where it had been commanded, which is in chapter 30. So God spoke to Moses saying, or the Lord spoke to Moses saying, make a laver of copper, this kior nechoshet, and a stand of copper for it, for washing. So there's a clear purpose for it, and place it between the tent of meeting and the altar, and then put water in it, and let Aaron and his sons wash their hands and feet from it. And when they enter the tent of meeting, they shall wash with water. Okay, it goes on. Nothing particularly crazy. Copper, washing, stand, water. Okay. But what we see here, there's a little addition. There's something a little bit different. Is that Bezalel, when he makes this copper washing station and its stand of copper, he makes it from the mirrors of the women who performed tasks at the entrance of meeting. So this is new. This is something that's different. This was not a command from God. He just said, God said, make it out of copper. Do that. But here, what Bezalel does is use these mirrors of women who perform tasks. Now, there's a lot of interesting things here. Why these mirrors? Why these women? What is going on? Now, there's a lot here to unpack. I found this really interesting article written by Professor Rachel Adelman, where she does talk about this. And you can see on the screen, it's an illustration of what this copper washing basin would look like. And first of all, one of the interesting things is she asks, where did these mirrors come from? They're not mentioned in chapter 35 with a list of all the raw material donated towards the making of the tabernacle, or as we just saw in 30:18 in God's original instructions to make the basin. So this is something different. Now, one thing that Professor Adelman, yes, one thing that this Professor Adelman points out is that marot is the fancy Latin term as hapax legomenon, but it's really just means this is the only appearance in the entire Bible of this word marot, meaning it's found nowhere else in the Bible. And the root of this is re'eh, is to see. And apparently, from archaeological findings, these ancient mirrors were traditionally slightly convex and made of copper, bronze, or brass, highly polished to allow for the reflection of a face. Okay. And what about this other word, sofa oat? So appears twice here. And usually, actually, this term is associated with military, but could also be cultic tasks. So things related here to the Mishkan. Again, that's a little bit strange, but maybe these women were doing something here. Maybe that they performed some sort of ritual service similar to what the Levites did. So the Levites were involved in performing public service regarding this Mishkan. And maybe these women were somehow auxiliaries. It's unclear exactly what that is. But these mirrors, apparently, according to Professor Adelman here, the mirror, both as object and symbol, became ritually metonymic for women and femininity in some ancient Near Eastern sources. So that's a really interesting aspect of having that. Now that we've considered that, I actually want to go to one of our favorite go-tos here, which is Rashi, sort of the prince, or the I don't know if king, but certainly the prince of Jewish medieval biblical commentators. And he says, these were the Benot Israel. These were the Israelitish women who possessed mirrors of copper into which they used to look when they adorned themselves. Even these did they not hesitate to bring as a contribution towards the tabernacle, towards the Mishkan here. Now Moses was about to reject them, since they were made to pander to their vanity. But their Holy One, is that the right word? Because, oh, interesting. The Hebrew was Moses was about to reject it because they were made for the evil inclination. And the evil inclination usually has something to do with sex or sexual desire. So it seems that Moses associated, which makes sense, women wanted to pretty themselves up. And Moses says, what is this sort of this helping of sexual desire? What does that have to do with the Mishkan? But the Holy One, blessed be he, said to him, accept them. These are dearer to me than all the other contributions, because through them, the women reared those huge hosts in Egypt. So that's the word Tzivaot, that apparently the women, while they were in Egypt, while the Jews were under that slavery that the Egyptians had enslaved them and really made a lot of hard work upon the Jews, or the Israelites, the Bnei Israel, while they were in Egypt, that these mirrors were instrumental in a lot of Jews being born, a lot of Israelites being born. So Rashi goes on. Clearly, there's some sort of midrash, and we've discussed midrash before of rabbinic narrative expansion. And clearly, it seems Rashi's drawing upon some sort of midrash. So he explains: for when their husbands were tired through the crushing labor they used to bring them food and drink and induce them to eat. Then they would take their mirrors, and each gazed at herself in her mirror together with her husband, saying endearingly to him, "See, I am handsomer than you." Thus they awakened their husband's affection and subsequently became the mothers of many children. As it is said in Song of Songs, "I awakened your love under the apple tree," referring to the fields where the men worked. This is what it refers to when it states Marot Hatzavaot, the mirrors of the women who reared the hosts. And it was for this reason that the laver, this washing basin bin, was made of these mirrors, because it served the purpose of promoting peace between man and wife by giving of its waters to be drunk by a woman. Oh, this is interesting. By a woman whose husband had shown himself jealous of her and who nevertheless had associated with another, thus affording her an opportunity to prove her innocence. You may know that the marot mentioned in the text were really mirrors. Okay. The laver, however, and its base are not mentioned there amongst the articles made from that copper. Hence, you may learn that the copper of which the laver was made was not a part of the copper of the weave offering, which is the only copper mentioned as having been contributed by the people. Okay. Now, this is really fascinating because on so many levels, it's really fascinating in considering these women's the Jewish women, the Bnot Yisrael, the Israelite women's contributions are these things that relate to beauty, that is something that is specific to women, and yet it's involved in the construction of the Mishkan. Now it's interesting because what Rashi quoted here, this midrash, involved Moses and the Holy One, blessed be He, in conversation. Interestingly, because if we were to take that and insert that back in the text, it would be Bezalel took these women's mirrors. It's not clear. Maybe he went out and he asked them, and maybe Moses thought, this is absurd. He was clearly bothered by this, according to this midrash. Moses was clearly bothered. So did Moses seek to insert himself in this and say, Bezalel, please don't do this? Not clear how that may or may not have happened, even according to that midrash. But clearly, Bezalel was given a certain, I guess, amount of free range in his ability to construct the Mishkan. Okay, so that's Rashi. It's a really fascinating midrash. We also have Ibn Ezra here, which is very similar. He says, Scripture states this because it is the custom of all women to beautify themselves. They look at their faces in brass or glass mirrors every morning to arrange the head coverings upon their head. Okay, interesting. Following up on what Rashi mentioned, we have a really interesting comment by Rabbi Moses, son of Nachman, also known by his acronym Ramban. So after quoting what Rashi had already written, he says, the meaning of this midrash is that in the whole work of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, they accepted ornaments from women, as it is written, and they came, both men and women, and brought nose rings and earrings and signet rings, the chumas. Okay, according to its midrashic interpretation, being even more undesirable, whatever this kumaz is. Okay. There, however, all the donations became mixed together, whereas here they were to make one specific vessel purely from ornaments, these mirrors, which were made to arouse sexual desire. Therefore, Moses did not consent at first until he was told to do so by the Almighty. And so Ramban continues. He says, but I do not know how to explain, according to this midrash, the phrase they did service at the door of the tent of meeting. So what does that even mean? He's saying, perhaps it can be said that the women brought this donation to Moses' tent, which he called the tent of meeting, and he himself received it from them by word of God, since the tent of the tabernacle had not yet been made. Okay. He said, this is interesting. In line with the plain meaning of Scripture, it is also possible to say that Moses made the laver, this copper washing basin, and its base for the mirrors of the women who came in a great crowd and assembled at the door of the tent of meeting in order to give their mirrors in the generosity of their hearts. Now, the brass of the mirrors was burnished brass, resplendent and very beautiful. It is for this reason that he set aside this brass from the beginning for the making of this vessel. Upon seeing this, the women gathered and came in many hosts. It's a lot of women. All of them wanting to give their mirrors for the making of the whole laver and its base. It is also correct to explain that they had in mind right at the start to offer them for the laver because of its use in connection with the suspected adulteress, which was mentioned above. And we actually brought it up in last week's Torah portion discussion. It comes from the book of Numbers. And they accepted the law upon themselves with joy and offered to give all of their mirrors. Now, it's really fascinating to see this interplay, because everybody has to, there's a lot of questions that arise. This wasn't included in that original set of instructions that we saw earlier from God in Exodus chapter 30. Where did this come from? Who came up with this idea? How was this acceptable? What do these mirrors signify? So we have in the Midrash, Moses is bothered by this, even though he's not really a party in this conversation. But Salah makes the decision. The women come forth. There's not a lot of, it's really fascinating, actually. This whole thing really essentially is narrative, actually, of Bezalel constructing. It's, in some ways, this Torah portion is really great for people, artists, right? Anybody who's an artist, this is a really great one. There's lots of materials involved, or really people who love working with their hands, or crafts people. Really great Torah portion for this. But there's a lot of action going on, a lot of description, a lot of narrative, and yet there's nothing. There's literally nothing that talks about how this all came about. How did Bezalel make the decision? Was there pushback? Did Moses push back? How did he get the announcement out? Did he tell the women? Were they okay with that? Did he ask them to bring something? Did they make the decision on their own? Was this his decision? We have nothing in the text that describes this whole process, the decision, the conversations. It just simply says this is what Bezalel did with these copper mirrors, incorporated them into the laver, which is how these midrashim pop up of Moses being bothered and having a conversation with God, of what we just saw in Ramban, where the women felt compelled to go to Moses and bring them these mirrors. One thing that also isn't even discussed at all of these texts that I just pointed out for our conversation, which is what happened afterwards. Why do they not need them? Was this all women? Were they able to make more mirrors? There's also a fascinating aspect where the mirrors, definitely according to the Midrash that we saw, really have a helpful explanation for what happened in Egypt, right? They were instrumental in the creation of the Tzovaot, right? The hosts, the many Israelites that were born in Egypt. Is this only looking backwards? I guess in one perspective, one could say, well, yes, because they needed them then, but they don't need them so much in the desert. And so they were happy to give them in. But I suspect they would probably still want more to use. Then again, if there were hundreds of thousands and possibly even millions of Israelites in the desert at the time, maybe they could share. Maybe they even had access to copper and could fashion some more. It's unclear. It's unclear of how that all turned out, but it is certainly curious, especially as I pointed out at the outset. We have the instruction in Exodus 30:18, and here in 38:8, it's an additional aspect with these women bringing their mirrors. Definitely lots of questions, really fascinating stuff. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what does happen is that they were able to fashion this laver, this copper washing station, washing basin, through with the use of these women's mirrors. And it's unclear how much maybe the women had a lot of agency. Maybe they said, oh, there's nothing specified for where this copper is supposed to derive in the construction of this basin. We want to have not just input. We want to be a part of this construction. We want to have specifically this involvement. Okay, this just popped into my head, but look, it's a long-standing Jewish tradition. Anybody makes a donation, especially to a physical item, their nameplate gets mentioned, right? Their name is on there, and maybe this is maybe they didn't write it on, but certainly people would know this washing basin was donated by the women specifically with their mirrors, and they were able to. They would look at it and they would see probably it was shiny. They would know that this was theirs specifically. It also brings up a question of how shiny, how reflective it was. Was it more reflective than other copper aspects or elements in the Mishkan and the tabernacle? I don't know. It'd be really interesting. Or who knows? What's the symbolism? We didn't see in those medieval commentators any mentions of particular symbolism. Yes, there's, what the mirrors are used for is women prettying themselves up for for their husband's affection. But what about what does this symbolism mean in the Mishkan? Clearly, nobody's thinking about it for those purposes, but maybe it has something to do with cleanliness, for hygiene, right? So that that it enveloping this water could help with hygiene. I don't know. That's not something that we saw in those commentators or midrashim for that matter. So I'm happy to hear further thoughts. There's obviously a lot to speculate, a lot to think about, a lot to consider in this topic. And I'm again, happy to hear any thoughts, comments, questions, queries, concerns, or other ideas that you may have on the contribution of these women's copper mirrors and the donation for this copper wash basin. So that's what I have for right now. Debbie, do you have any questions?
I understand clearly
Okay,
what you're
great.
talking about.
Great.
I think it's interesting about the questions about how it was used.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And like you say, it may have been something the women came up with, or the men. It's unclear.
Yeah.
A mystery.
It's a mystery, right? We don't know. Exactly. We just don't know. It's like you said, it's a mystery. It's a mystery. But that's where speculation and midrash come into play. And how much agency did the women have? How much was it Bezalel's decision? Did Moses even have a say in this? We don't know. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in this week to this week's Village Torah portion discussion with me. Before we go, I just want to acknowledge that all Jewish life and programming here at Cedar Village are due to the financial and moral support of Jewish Home of Cincinnati. So thank you so much. And with that, I want to say thank you again and Shabbat Shalom.